Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is, of course, Matthew Ho, who is, of course, one of my favorite guests who's come on for countless different subjects, previously on Ukraine, Israel a couple of weeks ago, Afghanistan, Iraq twice, actually, has obviously a wealth of knowledge from his personal experiences and just his continuation of following those cycles. So we spoke about Israel the other day, which wasn't planned. I wanted to speak to you about Ukraine, but with all the stuff going on with Israel, I thought it was important to discuss that. And I was kind of interested in your own perspective, as you are quite a balanced kind of person. And one of the balancing topics that I thought we could talk about today is something that's not really discussed, did Russia have other options? We know that the US and NATO provoked and kept poking the bear, expanding NATO. You have, Niet means Niet, the cable in 2008 from the now CIA director who was the ambassador to Russia saying, these are the red lines, Georgia and Ukraine. We kept pushing them. We know all about that. And we can get back into that later. But what isn't discussed is, does that necessarily mean Russia has a blank check to invade? And I think, most of the anti-war crowd don't believe that, but sometimes it may come across like that because they live in the US, they're covering the US side of it, the proxy war, we shouldn't be doing this. But you wrote an article about the other side. So just want to kind of lay out your points about that, and then I can just, ask you questions off that and maybe, play devil's advocate. So did Russia have other options? Was the West ever going to listen to them? What are your thoughts? And kind of just explain the basis of your article.
Sure. I think the idea of the article was that for all of Russia's state of intentions of doing this to protect to protect itself, to regain or to protect the people of Eastern Ukraine, certainly the actions that have followed have not done that, right? So the idea that this was some type of strategic move to achieve what couldn't be achieved through negotiations that were rebuffed by the United States and by NATO continuously. Every attempt Russia made to negotiate, whether it was in good faith or bad faith, unless you actually enter in negotiations, you don't know. And certainly, too, I think with showing the willingness of Russia to negotiate even after it invaded Ukraine, it shows that there was a desire there. So the question is, if negotiations are dismissed, if they're never entertained, if there's never even an option, then is military force a justifiable consequence of that? And I don't think it is. I mean, certainly there's international law that clearly states that this is, these types of preemptive attacks, these cross-border invasions are against international law. They are crimes against humanity. And this is well understood through the Charter of the United Nations, through the Fourth Geneva Convention, through the Rome Statutes, the International Criminal Court, and so forth. That there is no legal justification for what Russia did. Russia will claim that, well, the people of the Donbass invited us in. And there is a storyline that goes along with that. There were some actions taken by people in Donetsk and Luhansk to say we declare ourselves independent and we are calling on Russia to come defend us, which would seemingly fit the criteria for self-defense under the UN Charter. But that is just, again, a storyline. It just it doesn't hold water, and that's just in the same vein that then gives legitimacy to what NATO did in the Balkans, particularly with Kosovo, right? Which is one of the chief complaints of Russia when Russia speaks about what it is up against in terms of American hegemonic encroachment or NATO expansion. They always they begin with what happens to Serbia, what happens with Kosovo, and so that is their starting point. And for them now to say, well, this is why we did it, when it really is a mirror of the justification for Kosovo by the U.S. and NATO, that's not really credible. Like, that doesn't that doesn't really hold up. You can't have it both ways. So I don't think there was a legal justification there for what they did. And then in terms of the outcomes, whereas if the concern, and this is a legitimate concern, and I agree with the Russians saying that this is an issue of national security for us, but their actions in terms of going into eastern Ukraine, that does nothing to remove the NATO threat. That does nothing, say specifically with the issue of U.S. Cruise missiles in Poland and Romania. That does nothing to deal with that problem. And in terms of forcing back NATO, we have not seen that, and we will not see that. And in fact, we saw further NATO expansion because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with Sweden and Finland joining NATO after Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, so I think you look at whether it's a legal justification, whether it's by them saying that what they were trying to accomplish just doesn't marry up with the results. And what would have been the results? No invasion of Ukraine was going to do anything to remove the missiles from Poland and Romania. So the logic isn't there. The other aspects of it, in the sense of demilitarizing or denazifying Ukraine, and certainly we can get into the current circumstances of Ukraine, but unless Russia conquers, occupies, and subjugates all of Ukraine, and there is a danger of Ukraine collapsing and turning into a rump state, a failed state, basically. And that's a very real danger we can get into. And that's more to do, I think, with the idiocy of U.S. and NATO and Ukrainian moves more than Russian moves. But you're going to have, except for that, you're going to have a super militarized Ukraine. A month or two ago, Volodymyr Zelensky hosted this huge weapons conference in Kiev. Like 200 weapon makers showed up, and the idea was that we are gonna make Ukraine into the weapons factory of freedom. And this whole thing of this over militarization of Ukraine that's occurring and will occur. And so the idea you're going to demilitarize Ukraine. Now, certainly we can get into aspects about their manpower issues and the state of their forces right now. But in 2 or 3 years' time, that all can be negated by the amount of money that the West can put into Ukraine, which is another issue we can get into, whether or not that money will continue. Right. But again, that's got nothing to do with Russia. And anyone who tells me that they had a crystal ball and they saw that this, Ukraine aid was going to cause Speaker Kevin McCarthy to lose his job, and that you're going to get this guy Mike Johnson in, and he's kind of wishy-washy on it. Anyone who tells you that is full of it. Those are all occurrences due to the peculiarities of the United States. So any of those justifications tend to fall flat. So then it comes to your question of, well, what were the other options? And certainly the diplomatic option seems to have hit a wall. But the pursuit of it in the day or two before, Russia's invasion, Vladimir Putin hosts a televised meeting of his key people, of his top people, and he goes around. And a number of them, including Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, Dmitry Medvedev, who is the head of the National Security Committee, former president and prime minister himself, and others, including the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, they all say to continue with negotiations. We think negotiations are going pretty well. And Putin eventually says he accepts those comments, and then he decides, of course, to invade. So you see, even at high levels, publicly, they're saying we can go further with negotiations. And I don't buy into the idea that was all just drama, that was theater, that was a propaganda act. I think those were sincere comments. And so the idea of diplomacy was always there, but also too then, what other options were there? And there certainly were economic options. You've seen the effects on energy In terms of Russia had that type of leverage over Europe, has that type of leverage throughout the world with energy. Certainly, you see what has occurred in the Black Sea with the blockade of Ukraine, the effect it had on the Ukrainian economy, of course, but then on a larger level on the world stage in terms of world food prices. I mean, so Russia had a tremendous amount of leverage both with energy and food that they could have used to put pressure on the rest of the world to pay attention to what was happening in Ukraine. Certainly, this is related to diplomatic channels, but they could have joined the ICC and made a complaint that way. I mean, in terms of trying to pursue these international institutions, the Russians have always taken the United Nations seriously. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, if I recall correctly, was the Russian ambassador to the UN. They put very serious people into those positions. So they certainly also too see how the United Nations is a broken process, and particularly with the ability of the vetoes. And they don't have that. They certainly have their interests they can protect with vetoes, but I think they see that how unbalanced that is, how powerful the U.S. is in the UN, and how with that veto process, they would prefer to give up their vetoes and take that risk than to continue to allow the U.S. to veto everything to maintain its control, its power, its hegemony. So, I mean, that kind of leads into another thing as you look in to see how far along BRICS has come, right? The consortium of the first 5 nations and now 11 nations, if I recall correctly. 6 more are joining. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they're being joined by, let's see if I can remember this, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, possibly Argentina, and who else am I forgetting?
Saudi Arabia,
Iran, Ethiopia, Argentina. I'm forgetting.
I can get it up on the screen.
Yeah, we'll look it up. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're taping this so you can edit this all up and make it clean. So, but anyway, but that type of pathway where you see the success of these institutions that have formed and are growing to counter American and European dominance and primacy, and not just counter them, but to provide alternatives, not just as workarounds, not just as bypasses, but as actual alternatives, as institutions that stand on their own and are something that can be utilized without having to go through the U.S. economic world order. So I think there are a number of things the Russians could have pursued rather than dive into war, because now here you are 20 months into the war, where arguably, yes, Ukraine is in very bad shape, but I don't believe Russia is in any position to do anything more than hold on to what they've already captured. I think the idea that they could do more, I just don't think that's possible, particularly with the evolution of drone technology just in these last 20 months. I think the idea of them being able to mass their forces and conduct a World War II style armored and mechanized infantry advance is just not possible with the state of the drones right now. So as well then too, I don't think they have the desire to want to become an occupying army, because what they have taken in Eastern Europe or Eastern Ukraine are areas that have largely been depopulated or are sympathetic to the Russian invasion. So they're not occupying lands where they are facing the hazards that, say, the U.S. Army faced in Afghanistan and Iraq, or the Soviet Army faced in Afghanistan, right? I think the Russians are at least smart enough to realize that. And then whether or not they have the actual wherewithal in terms of logistics and the tail to support some type of advance, into central Ukraine, to take Kiev and subjugate Ukraine, in a World War II style. I just don't think they have either the desire or the ability to do that. So they're stuck in this, conflict that is as the Ukrainian as the senior Ukrainian military commander said today, as a stalemate reminiscent of World War I, which is what many of us have been saying for quite a long time now.
Well, you laid out, obviously, a good case there. So just for me, I'm just going to play kind of devil's
Sure.
advocate. So on your first point about the diplomatic route, would you not say, there was no point going down those avenues? I know you said they had that televised meeting that I'll put in the show notes. I haven't actually seen it myself, so I will have to go and watch that. People would say, well, the US and NATO are never going to go along with these diplomatic talks because years and years and years of, RAND documents and military documents saying that Russia, and China, whoever else, they are the enemy, playing out different scenarios to bog Russia down, that this is what they want. So diplomacy isn't going to work. And as we have seen, you could say Russia didn't play it out, of course. Mm-hmm. But what we have seen is, you kind of implied it at the start, I think, and there's been various reporting on this, but the best one is the then Israeli Naftali Bennett, who was Prime Minister kind of before Netanyahu. He was mediating talks between Ukraine and Russia. And he says this on his podcast. Again, I'll put this up. And he's talking about how he's mediating between Russia and Ukraine. It was going well. Ukraine gave up these concessions of joining NATO, and Russia gave up big concessions too. And during this period, he was talking to Macron, Scholz, so France, Germany, Boris Johnson from the UK, and Biden from the US, all the time, keeping them up to date. He said that France and Germany were quite pragmatic. And if you remember at the time, obviously, they wasn't, as they are now. Mm-hmm. But Boris Johnson and the US basically said, no, we don't want peace. And he kind of explicitly says, Boris Johnson was very aggressive with this. The US and the UK basically said, no, we don't want peace talks.
רשמתי מעין פרוטוקול של מה היה, ואז מה הצעדים הבאים, בסוף מה המחלוקות במשא ומתן ומה צריך מכל אחד. משם אני חושב שביחד אפילו, אבל אני לא בטוח, עדכנו את האמריקאים, ואת מקרון.
מה זה אמריקאים? ביידן עצמו או ש...
לא, הפעם, זה היה בדרך כלל מול היועץ לביטחון לאומי ג'ייק סליבן, לפעמים מול ביידן, לפעמים מול בלינקן. הם מאוד הדוקים שם. כן. ובוריס ג'ונסון. עכשיו, אתה יודע, היו כל מנהיג והדרך שלו. בוריס היה, בוא נגיד, אפשר לחלק ספקטרום של מנהיגים, מי יותר נוטה לקו של עכשיו צריך להילחם בפוטין.
כי הוא הרע ואסור לתגמל את הרעים.
נכון.
ומי אומר, אבל עזוב יש המלחמה, במלחמה כולם מפסידים.
נכון, ובוא נגיד, בוריס ג'ונסון היה מאוד בקו התקיף, הייתי אומר שמקרון ושולץ היו בקו היותר פרגמטי נקרא לזה, וביידן גם וגם, ואז נגיד את זה בצורה רחבה, אני חושב שהייתה החלטה של המערב לגיטימית, שכרגע צריך להמשיך להכות בפוטין ולא להגיע.
אבל מה זה להכות בפוטין? פוטין ניקה באוקראינה, לא?
שנייה, לא, בסדר, אבל שאל מול, זאת אומרת, הגישה היותר תקיפה, כן. אני אגיד לך משהו, אני לא יודע להגיד שהם שגו.
כי אתה אומר, אולי בריונים אחרים בעולם היו רואים את זה.
העמדה שלי באותו הזמן, בעניין הזה זה לא אינטרס לאומי ישראלי. כן. בשונה מקונסוליה או איראן, שאני דואג לישראל, עומד חזק פה, כן. אין לי סי, אני בסך הכל כן. מוציא לפועל ומתווך, אבל הכתובת שלי זה אמריקה בעניין הזה, ואני לא פועל על דעת עצמי. כל פעולה שעשיתי הייתה מתואמת כן. לפרטי פרטים, גם עם ארצות הברית, גם עם גרמניה, גם עם צרפת.
אז הם בעצם חדלו את זה?
בגדול, כן. בגדול הם חדלו את זה, ובאותו זמן חשבתי שהם שוגים. לעומת זאת, ואני לא אומר את זה בציניות, לעומת זאת, יש פה אמירה, לראשונה אחרי המון שנים, הנשיא ביידן השכיל לייצר אליינס שכזה, אל מול תוקפן בתפיסה הכללית, וזה מקרין גם על זירות אחרות, כמו סין, טיואן, ויש לזה השלכות. לכן מוקדם לדעת. אני לא אומר פה, יש לי טענה אחת, והדבר השני אני לא טוען. אני טוען שבסבירות לא רעה אפשר היה להגיע.
אם הם לא חודלים את זה?
אם הם לא חודלים, לא בטוח. אבל אני לא טוען שזה היה נכון. בזמן אמת חשבתי שנכון להגיע להפסקת אש. עכשיו, אני לא יודע להגיד.
אתה אומר, אולי באמת זה היה מתגמל את הבריון בצורה מהירה מדי.
יכול להיות שהיה משדר מסרים לא נכונים למקומות אחרים. מדינאות זה דבר מאוד מאוד מורכב, ויש גם דברים שאני לא רוצה לפרט פה, למה יכול להיות שזה היה נכון או לא נכון.
וגם אולי הם לא רצו שתצליח, יכול להיות? אז בוא תציג קודם את הפשרה שלך, עד כמה שאתה יכול להשיג, לפני שאתה מספר על הפגישה עצמה.
אז בעצם היו כמה סוגיות, בוא נגיד הסוגיות המרכזיות, בפגישה עם פוטין, הוא נתן לי שני ויתורים מאוד גדולים, שהיום זה כאילו מובן מאליו, אבל זה לא היה מובן מאליו.
בפגישה הראשונה עם פוטין, לפני
לא, בפגישה
בשבת.
בשבת. תכף נספר את זה, אבל רק נגיד, הוא ירד מדנאציפיקציה. קרי, מלחסל את זלנסקי.
מה, הוא ממש אמר לך במילים האלה?
אני על זה, בגלל שזה כל כך, זה הדבר הכי יקר, זה חיי מנהיג. מכל מקום, זה היה ויתור אחד. הוויתור השני, הוא ירד מפירוז אוקראינה. גם זלנסקי עשה ויתור מאוד גדול באותה שבת. אני חושב שאנחנו מדברים על השבת השנייה אחרי פרוץ המלחמה. היה פרוץ המלחמה, היה יום חמישי או משהו כזה, הייתה שבת הבאה, הייתי במוסקבה, וזלנסקי ירד מהצטרפות לנאטו, הוא אמר, אני מוותר על זה. אלה צעדים אדירים של כל צעד, אדירים, ויתורים מאוד גדולים, המלחמה כולה קרתה, בגלל הדרישה להיכנס לנאטו, ובא זלנסקי ואומר, אני יורד מזה.
We know that now, so in the defense of your argument, Russia didn't play it out, but, this is evidence, and we've seen previous times, the constant demonization of Russia, not willing to listen to them in previous times, that the diplomatic route was never going to work, because not only does the US not take them serious, like, trying to overthrow one of their allies like Syria, that Russia and, the US also wanting, explicitly kind of black and white to bog down Russia in a scenario like this, they was never going to take it serious. So with that diplomatic route, even if they went through that, would that have gone anywhere? As also, even if Ukraine wanted it, the US kind of has heavy influence and the nationalists there. So would the diplomatic route really gone anywhere, do you think, in honesty?
Yeah, that's an excellent counterpoint, and this is I think something that why many of us say this is why we have to have a revolution in U.S. and U.K. and Western foreign policy, because you create these circumstances where it seems as if the only option then is to go to war. If you're not going to talk to us, and if you do talk to us, you're going to lie to us, and as you were saying, they were never going to honor any agreements. We have Francois Hollande, we have Angela Merkel, we have Petro Poroshenko, all on record as saying we were never going to follow Minsk II. We were using Minsk II just for time to build up the Ukrainian military, right? So you have all that bad faith. I think I look at this in two ways. One, which would be worse? A status quo from 2021 now. So 2 years where you have had intermittent violence. And you can remember the violence in the Donbass doesn't really spike until a month or two before Russia's invasion. So it's fairly quiet. I mean, people are still being killed, but the bulk of the 14,000 people who were killed before Minsk II. So even though we know there is bad faith with Minsk II, even though we know that it ultimately fails, of course, but that it was far from perfect, it still was providing a degree of a ceasefire. And so 2 years on, would that have been preferable to this wholesale slaughter and ruination that we see, with all the dangers of escalation that comes from it, plus, all the intended consequences? And so as we move forward in the war in Ukraine, we see this horizontal escalation, or the fear of horizontal escalation, that the war will spread into other nations. And then, of course, the fear of vertical escalation, that newer and bigger and more dangerous weapons will be introduced up to and including nuclear weapons. I mean, is that our current circumstance with Ukraine, is that better than if the status quo from 21 had just been extended until now? And I'm not Vladimir Putin. I'm not Dmitry Medvedev. I'm not Sergei Lavrov. I don't have their perspective. I'm not under their pressure. I don't have their desires. I certainly don't see things their way. But I'm sitting here and thinking, like, I think that would have been better if status quo 2021 had moved on. And, and the other aspect, that then touches on is that, well, what were the conditions that created such that it seemed as if there would never be any diplomacy, that there was no possibility of negotiation solving this, even though everybody, when you have a conversation about this, regardless of who they are, will eventually say, I'm not just saying regardless of who they are, because there are some who do believe that this is only a military solution is possible. But most sane and objective people will say that this is only a political settlement can resolve this. And, so what do we do? What can we do to create the conditions that a political settlement are possible? And you need internet. I spoke about this a little bit before. You need strong international institutions. You need an adherence and a upholding of international law. You need to follow the treaties that you have signed and agreed to. Those types of things, which we have gotten so far away from since the end of the Cold War. Though you roll into that and you say, okay, that said, the mendacity of the West in all of this, acknowledged and accepted, still, does that mean that what we're seeing now is better than having just accepted the mendacity and still tried to persevere on through it, rather than go to war? Because you look at the destruction that will come from years because of the toxic legacy of the war, the environmental catastrophe of it, and then the generational impacts on Ukrainians and Russians, due to the war. And I just don't see how that, it makes the argument that this war is better than the mendacious peace that it disrupted.
Just before I reply to that, just out of interest, how long do you have? So we're about 23 minutes in. Obviously, we was chatting before. How long do you have till you have to jump off? Just so I know, ballpark.
Hang on one second. Let me just check this message.
A little bit out, but so where you was just finishing up there was other options. They could have continued the diplomacy route, as that's a much better situation than we're in now. And you would obviously have to agree with that scenario. That would be a lot better, just how it was in the Donbass region, rather than a full-scale war, nuclear tensions, Russian and Western tensions, probably the worst they've been since the Cold War. People might argue even worse. And we can get to your energy argument in a second, but let me just take, again, devil's advocate. I'm going to be, more of the pro-Russian military route. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, okay, so it's been how many years since 2014 we've been playing this game. We live in the real world where, if this was the US wouldn't have had any of this. And as a normal, person, a normal civilian, you can have these ideals that, the world doesn't have to work like this. There's no need for military action, all that hippie ideals. Right. That's not how the world works. It's military force. And we all know the US would have done it already. And Russia tried the diplomatic route. It's not even as bad as the US, where they haven't gone to all these other wars. And this is actually their neighbor. And they tried all of this working with the West since 2014. And enough was enough. They weren't listening. They was continuing to say Ukraine was going to join. They was continuing to train them, arm them. And it was only getting more and more and more. And the only way to stop that, because the diplomatic channels, as we see with Blinken and China, where the US constantly pokes at China, and then they send Blinken there saying, no, we want to ease tensions. We don't want conflict with China. But then they will sail a warship through there, or they do this, or they say this to the Taiwanese. Clearly, it's going out through one ear, out the other. So the only option is the military option, because this is our red line. And in a world of realism, this is how states and governments operates. So it is Russia's right. Not right, but they gave it a good go. Why can't they use military force like the US would, as they saw that as too far, and the US wouldn't accept the same?
I think, I mean, and those are all, fair and good arguments, right? I mean, there's nothing I would scoff at and say, that's, it's not like some of the arguments you're hearing for the current, in support of or apologizing for the current ethnic cleansing in Gaza, right? Where you can just dismiss those and say, but these, I think, are real arguments that have very strong points to them. I think what happens with Russia as they make this decision is they have a very good assessment of where the Ukrainians are at. There are people who say, well, they underestimated the Ukrainian military. They thought it would be a quick and easy victory. I think, and we don't know this because the Russians have been very tight-lipped about this, and we've not had any leaks, and maybe hopefully WikiLeaks will find something at some point and inform us about what their intentions were, what their initial goals were. But to me, it seems as if their goals were a negotiated settlement right away. And so I think the Russians had an understanding that the Ukrainians would go to the table. And we saw exactly that happen. So they launched a three-pronged offensive, if I remember correctly, including coming down from Belarus straight towards the capital, but with only about 25,000 men. So not nearly enough to capture and occupy a foreign capital. I don't think anyone's going to look at it and say that was a true invasion force meant to take the capital and win the war. But rather it was more of a chokehold, right? Getting your hand around the other guy's throat and threatening to strangle him to bring them to the table. And they were successful because the Ukrainians do go to negotiations, right? First in Belarus, then in Turkey. As you were saying, Naftali Bennett spoke about this, and widely reported in nearly whatever news service you want to look up, Financial Times, the BBC, Reuters. This was widely reported on in February and March of 2022, leads to a 15-point draft peace plan. And then the Americans and the Brits, as you were saying, Boris Johnson especially, come in and they say, you're not going to do this. Don't do this. We're going to give you everything you need to win the war. This goes into the tragic story of Volodymyr Zelensky and his own journey through this. And I don't want people, when I say tragic, I'm thinking more along the lines of Shakespearean or Greek tragic, as opposed to I've got this enormous sympathy for him. But, where he is elected, he on a peace platform, he does not have government service prior, as everyone knows, right? He was an actor, he was a comedian, and a successful one. And he campaigns on a peace platform, and he gets 70% of the vote. And his thing is, he is going to go and meet with Vladimir Putin, and they are going to resolve the issues in eastern Ukraine. They're going to end that civil war. And you have almost immediately, from what we understand, the ultra right, the ultra nationalists, the far right, the neo Nazis tell Zelensky that will be the end of him if he does. They basically, some stories say they pointed a gun at his head, figuratively, or maybe literally. Others, they pointed at a tree, and said that'll be where you hang from. Again, figurative or literally. And, but make him, and in the Americans, of course, and the Brits as well, their attitude towards it was, well, remember what happened in 2014 when we removed Yushchenko from power. Yanukovych from power. Excuse me. Hang on one second, because someone's walking up. Okay, and actually my housemate just pulled up, so in a couple minutes the dogs are going to go bonkers anyway. But okay, they go back. So anyway, yeah, the Americans and the British reminded of what happened in 2014, and that they can do that again. There could be a coup that can happen to him, and then we have, provocation upon provocation, and then the refusal of negotiations, and then the Russian invasion, and you see this immediate acceptance of negotiations by the Ukrainians with the Russians that we described. And then what happens as they produce this draft peace plan, and almost immediately, again, widely reported in Western press, Volodymyr Zelensky says, we can accept neutrality. We don't need to be in NATO. And both sides are ready to make concessions, as you were describing. And, but then the Americans and British come in and say, you're not going to do that. And we will give you everything you need to be the Churchill of our time, right? To be a hero of history. You're going to be the ones who stood up to Vladimir Putin and his hordes, all that type of stuff. And then, of course, he now, as we know from a really candid, quite well done article in Time magazine that just came out by Simon Schuster, his not just the betrayal he has experienced from that, how he feels he's been betrayed by the West, but then also too the delusion that he has entered into, I think probably because of this tragic journey. And I think people can look at that and understand how you could have somebody go mad, as he is basically described by his staff. They call him messianic. He thinks of himself as messianic, and they describe him as being deluded. So all of that, goes back to what were the Russians trying to accomplish with their initial invasion? And was it just to get to these negotiations? And so that's an awfully big risk for them to take. And I think they did assess correctly, right, that the Ukrainians would negotiate right away, but they failed to assess that the Americans and British would come in and stop it, and then promise these things to Zelensky that appealed to his ego and certainly met with the spirit and desires of the far right that populated some very key important aspects of the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian media, the Ukrainian military. So, that assessment fails then, because here they are, rather than being in launching an invasion, getting into negotiations, and then getting what they want in eastern Ukraine, and presumably pulling all their troops out, because that was part of the peace plan as well, was that you would have a full Russian withdrawal, back to the borders of February 24, 2022. So I don't think their intentions were to be an occupying force. So you look at that and you say, okay, now here they are stuck in this war, in this stalemate. The idea of them advancing in such a way to subjugate all of Ukraine, it just doesn't seem like they have that ability. Maybe they do. Maybe they'll surprise me and they'll launch like a 2 corps of armored and mechanized units. But the problem with that being is, and then you face not just the issues of being an occupier, everything comes with it, but you also face a collapsed country that you're now responsible for. And you face the very real danger then of, you can imagine how this could happen. Say Ukraine does collapse and the Russians bolt forward and they're heading towards central Ukraine. What's not to say that the Poles and the Romanians wouldn't push over the border into Ukraine themselves to provide a buffer between them and the Russian forces that are racing towards Ukraine's western and southwestern borders, right? So then you have this issue of, my God, now you really might have NATO and NATO countries, NATO armed forces coming into contact with Russian armed forces, right? So that's not anything the Russians want. So again, you play all this out as it has occurred, and you say they made these errors. How does this benefit them strategically? Because I think, again, any of the things you're going to point to and say, well, look at how popular BRICS is now, and look at how many nations around the world are standing with them, not voting with the U.S. and the UN. Those things were going to happen anyway. They were going to happen anyway. And you can make the moral argument that by initiating this war, they've lessened their moral authority, particularly among, or at least legitimacy, say, among nations, although they still enjoy support. But that support is not, I don't see it as pro-Russia as much as it is anti-U.S. And that in that attitude by so many countries in the world existed prior to February 24th, 2022, right? So it's just that this is just, so I look at it all that way, and I just say, it's what the value that they got in invading, sparking this war, where it is now, the costs, the dangers of escalation, the fact that what does the future hold? How do they get out of this? Because that's another aspect we haven't even spoke about. How do the Russians get out of this conflict? And that's why I think a lot of us, when things weren't going so well for Russia, say a year ago, there was a lot of talk was that, you got to offer them a golden bridge. You got to give them a way to get out that saves face for them. Otherwise, they're stuck. And, this is something Tolstoy talks about in War and Peace all the time, about the need to give Napoleon a golden bridge, because otherwise you're fighting a trapped and cornered enemy. And not only that, if you give people a way out, you're pretty sure where that's going to lead to. But if you re-enter into the fighting, well, it's warfare, so it's unpredictable, and the consequences that can come from it can be really nasty, unintended consequences. So, all those things I think I look at when I say this was a mistake by the Russians, because then again, it goes back to, did it stop NATO encroachment? Did it stop NATO enlargement? Has it removed the missiles from Poland and Romania? No, it hasn't. And anyone who thinks that Russia's a threat to NATO, well, they've been able to contact, including Crimea, they've conquered 17 or 18% of Ukraine. You take Crimea out of it, that means they've conquered roughly 10% of Ukraine in the last 20 months. And so we in the West are supposed to be afraid of them, so yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely some fair points in there. And again, my counter argument earlier that the West isn't willing to negotiate with Russia because they obviously crashed the peace talks. According to the US's main ally, Israel's then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, is also, again, you could see that as a counter as well. That shows Russia was willing to negotiate, and they genuinely did. And Ukraine gave concessions. And again, I'm not actually playing devil's advocate here, but you can also point to the fact maybe Zelensky now is kind of deluded and thinks, I'm in this now, I'm going to keep going, but then probably didn't think like that. There was actually an interview he did with Fareed Zakaria on CNN, where he actually admitted on CNN that in private, he was told that Ukraine would never join NATO or the EU, but he was told to say publicly the door was still open.
But everyone in the West told me that we do not have any chance of NATO and EU membership. I asked them not to drive the Ukrainian people into a corner, because our people are brave, and the West should also be brave in telling directly to the Ukrainian people that, well, you're not going to be NATO and EU member. They do not have a consolidated position, and I requested that personally. I requested them personally to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO in a year or 2 or 5. Just say it directly and clearly, or just say no. And the response was very clear. You're not going to be a NATO or EU member, but publicly the doors will remain open.
So maybe his frame of mind when he was negotiating is, well, I'm never actually going to join NATO anyway. Do I really want to risk all of this when he probably knows that Russia, well, is the stronger army, has more resources, and, he may have thought, well, the US has bailed on people before, bailed on other wars, I could be another one of those. So there's definitely weight to that. Just to get to kind of and I was actually going to counter again with the BRICS, that since this invasion, it has maybe, as you said, accelerated that people are taking sides, and because the US is saying you can't be neutral, take a side, just like the Cold War, and you're saying, well, countries actually were taking Russia's side. And again, maybe I'd counter that you said, well, it would happen anyway, and that it's harmed Russia's reputation as it did do this. Most of those governments and maybe populations around the world see it as a similar struggle as them, the US and the West have for years and years and years done this. And this was just something Russia had to do. I'm still there. My camera's just gone I'm still here. This is something Russia had to do. They don't see it like, most people in the Western population. They see it for what it is. This is a proxy war. The US is just as bad as Russia, and Russia stuck up for itself, probably thinking, maybe I wish my government, did this. So who knows there? But just before we kind of move on to the current situation with Ukraine and Zelensky, just on the energy argument. So you said that Russia had economic options, obviously ones which you wouldn't want, because it's still economic warfare. Like sanctions is a form of warfare that harms the common person who doesn't have any say in the decisions against what the US and the UK or whoever does. So with this energy war, it could have turned off the Nord Stream pipelines before they was bombed, and put pressure on Europe, as we know, Europe was heavily, including Germany, obviously reliant on Russian gas and oil, which obviously the US didn't want and wanted them buying their own LNG. And we obviously saw that shoot right up, but that's a different story. That strategy wouldn't work, because in the information war, Russia knows that it's lost. Maybe not in Europe, so you could maybe counter me on that, but in the UK, the US, and in Europe, Russia's been so demonized for so many years. You have the Cold War, the Soviet Union, all this legacy, and this constant demonization of Russia and the Western mind, and also the ignorance of the Western mind that they don't know what's going on in the Donbass and all of this stuff, and that Ukraine are shelling them, and the Minsk agreements. Most people have never heard of that. So when Russia turns off the gas and their mainstream press puts up headlines, Russia is, bringing these winters that are going to kill 10,000 people in this country, and the elderly aren't going to be able to afford their bills and all of this. They're going to see the headlines. They're going to feel it themselves. They're going to see the price of this shoot up. And they're not going to, there's not going to be every day, stories about what's going on in Donbass and this is why Russia's doing it. It's going to see Russia is economically harming us. They're going to see them as the enemy. And maybe in some European countries, because it is very different probably to the UK and the US. So I guess my counterpoint would be, Russia knows it's lost the information war. So if it pulls a move like that, they're just going to see it as, Russia is doing this economic war, and they don't really understand why. And they might hear stuff, well, it's because of this. And they're like, well, that's not good enough, because when push comes to shove, people are going to be selfish and think for their family, and they're not going to care. And they're going to get out protesting their own governments to stop backing Ukraine, or are they going to protest outside a Russian embassy? So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't know how much the Russian government cares what the New York Times or what BBC or the Daily Mail or whoever says about them. Like, I don't. They certainly do care, because they keep an eye, like all governments do, on public opinion, whether it's theirs or foreign public opinion. But how much of that would have an impact on their decision making, when, as you said, they were damned whatever they did. Whatever they did, they were going to be demonized. If they did nothing, they would be demonized. And we saw that. We saw that here in the U.S. with the 2016 elections, where you had some troll farms, an internet troll farm that I guess was connected with I've forgotten his name already. The former head of Wagner, who was killed in the plane assassination. Oh God, how quickly, right? Anyway, but was that? Prigozhin, yes, thank you. So so you have that internet troll farm that was connected somehow to Prigozhin, sell or the amount that they actually bought in terms of Facebook ads was nothing. It was insignificant, particularly when compared to, say, the campaigns of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. You get into all the details of that, and like half the ads they posted weren't even posted until after the election, and only a small percent of the ads actually were pro-Trump or anti-Clinton or had anything to do with the election. I mean, it was just a nothing. There was nothing there. And still, you saw how demonized the Russians were for it. So they were going to be demonized no matter what. So that information space, the public perception, the public relations, whatever you want to call it, certainly is important. But I think they recognize that they were going to be damned anyway. I would think that one of the things I would say about the argument that had economic options that they could have gone into an energy blockade was that would, and this is where this argument falls in parts, that then would play right into the hands of the Americans, because so much what's occurring in Ukraine and in Europe in general has to do with the liquid natural gas market and the desire for the United States to dominate it, which it has. The United States now is the largest exporter of LNG. And if you go back and you look back to 2012 or so, when the United States really starts to shift in its attitudes towards Russia. If people remember in 2012 when President Obama is debating Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney says in one of the debates about how Russia is America's chief adversary, and Obama just cuts him down. And he says, that's ridiculous. That makes no sense whatsoever. You don't know what you're talking about. And within a year, you've seen this reversal. You saw a reversal of American policy towards Russia. And that had a lot to do with the success of the fracking, the expansion of the liquid natural gas industry in the U.S. In that time frame, 2012, 2013, 2014, you saw permit after permit for the construction or the expansion of liquid natural gas export facilities throughout the United States, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico and on the East Coast. And massive, billions and billions of dollars, right? Where was that gas going to go? The idea it was going to go to Europe. And so who's providing the gas now? The Russians. Well, that there is your foundational, the foundation for this demonization of Russia that the United States launches into in the second part of the Obama administration, the last half of the Obama administration. You see again this shift in policy where the United States gets very hostile towards Russia. Has a lot to do with we want to be the ones selling liquid natural gas to the Europeans. So if the Russians turn off the Nord Stream pipeline, and other sources of gas to Europe, well, then that plays right into the Americans' hands. Right. So, yeah, there certainly are holes in the argument. But then again, the military invasion was going to cause that economic, that energy loss anyway. Right. And it hasn't been complete because the Europeans are still importing a ton of fuel, right? A ton of fossil fuels from Russia. Right. One of the really dirty secrets of this war is how much the Europeans and the U.S. and the U.K. to a degree, but not nearly as much as the Europeans continue to consume, continue to import, continue in terms of trade with Russia. It's massive, maybe not as much as before, but it's still really big. And that includes, gas. They were going to run into that problem anyway of ceding a portion of the European energy market to the Americans. If they did a type of energy blockade. But once the military was going to happen, then, and the other thing, too, with the energy blockade, then, well, you're the one whose hands on the dial, right? So they can turn it up, turn it down, turn it off, turn it back on. In this case, it's sanctions directed directly toward them. And I'm not saying I'm in favor of it because I believe in international law, and that would be a unilateral coercive measure, which is illegal under international law, as are almost all the sanctions the United States has against like 25% of the world's population or whatever it is, right? I'm not condoning it. Just would that have been a better option than where we are right now? Because the other thing, too, is that it's much more controllable in terms of your response. Again, you can turn it up, you can turn it down, and escalation can still occur, but it's less likely or maybe less dramatic. Right now, as we're seeing, and we have seen, the dangers of escalation on top of the death and destruction, right? Which just that in itself is a whole volume as to why this war is such a catastrophe. It makes no sense. You're destroying. If you're going to say criticizing Russia, you're destroying eastern Ukraine to save it. The reports the last couple of days have been that the Russians have launched some of their largest artillery bombardments of the war, hit like 120 different villages and towns of Ukraine. And their argument is we pushed into Ukraine to protect the people. right? So to protect them from the Nazis. And I mean, so that type of humanitarian destruction, right? That humanitarian intervention, which again, they say, well, the West has done it before, so now we're doing it. And I think you and I and folks who are listening would say, well, they have pox on both then. But yeah, it is. We keep coming back to the same thing. The deliberate refusal to negotiate, the deliberate diplomatic malpractice by the U.S., the U.K., and NATO put the whole world into position was what was available to be done, what could have been done, every action that was available, because you refused to negotiate, refused to talk. You just had basically a hierarchy of least worst options, and for reasons that we fully don't understand, and maybe we will. Again, hopefully WikiLeaks or someone like that will find this information for us. The Russians chose, in my opinion, to pursue the worst option, which was a military invasion.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been loads of good points there on the kind of the economic turning off the gas option. Yeah, you could see how Russia could turn that off and play into the US's hands. And also the US could be the hero of like, don't worry, guys, we're going to supply you with LNG. Don't worry about Russia turning that off. All the headlines are Russia turns off the gas. Look at the US. All these European countries and certain members of, parties saying the US isn't a solid ally. We shouldn't be that reliant on them. Look at them now. They're, our knight in shining armor. They've given us LNG, or they're selling us LNG when Russia doing that. But then to counter that, you can be like, well, again, like you said, it was always going to end up like that anyway, as we've seen. The Europeans were forced to buy LNG off the US.
At a much higher rate too, because we ship. I mean, basically, it's simple. Russians send theirs over via pipeline. We send ours via ship. Guess which is more expensive? And now there's a markup as well because of the fossil fuel companies are, hey, this war that gives us a tremendous ability to mark up the price.
Don't get me started about Shell Garage and BP. So it's all inflation, and then Shell Garage puts out a press release sometime this year. Best profits in 115 years. 115 years, over a century ago, when, the British Empire and, but anyway, that's a different story. So, I mean, I think you made some good points there. I mean, obviously, if someone else was sitting here, they may have gone harder on you on certain bits. I thought it was, you definitely made some good points. And as we've kind of said, whatever you think about Russia and what they could have done, the fact that the US and the UK, while Russia was trying to negotiate, completely just destroyed that. Even if you're like Russia, I don't like Putin, I don't like their regime, I don't like Russia, blah, blah, blah. Well, look at your own government. They clearly don't care about the Ukrainian people or the humanitarian side. There's no argument to be like, we're going to put an end to these negotiations because we want Ukraine to beat Russia. And in the meantime, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have to die. They have to lose land. They have to have land destroyed. If it was a humanitarian, we care about the Ukrainians. Yeah, no, great. Yeah, let's get this sorted. We didn't want to go this far because Ukraine's our ally and we care about the Ukrainian people and we're not willing to see them die. But that's not what you hear. It's all proxy war talk, and the best ones, obviously, and again, tied into kind of Israel now, we have to back Ukraine as a message to China. All this nonsense, and, just all this proxy war talk. It's not like we care about the Ukrainian people, like Lindsey Graham, to the last Ukrainian. This is the best money we've ever spent. Russians are dying. Oh, so are Ukrainians, by the way. How are those Russians dying? The Ukrainians are dying to kill them. So whatever you think about Russia, and obviously we was going on the other side of what Russia could have done, but there's just a million counter arguments of how bad the US and the UK are, and that they're worse than Russia, and they would have done this, and look at this and this and this. So we never know what would happen with those peace talks. Did you want to say something? Sorry?
I was going to say, we also have to acknowledge just how the depth of the historical, the cultural, the social, the mythological the reality of the identification of the people and the peoples of this are. Right. This is a deep historical drama. Russia is very unhappy that Finland joined NATO. Right. And the fact that they have this, I can't remember, it's 800 miles or 800-kilometer long border with Finland. Right. I mean, but now that's a NATO's on that border as well. Russia's not happy about that at all. And they've said how we're going to move more troops up there, and this will be part of our expansion of our army and everything else. And it's like, great. So a more militarized border, terrific. Everyone in the world should really appreciate that. But they're not as upset about it as they were with Ukraine. And in the past, they did make statements. They don't want to see Finland joining or Sweden joining or anything else. But they didn't have that emotional, historical, spiritual connection to it. And certainly Finland and Sweden and Russia have a very long history, right? Very long history. But there is something about the Ukrainian-Russian story, that intertwined history, that is so important to Russia and so important to Ukraine as well, that we have to always recall and at least have, I think, in our heads that this goes well beyond looking at this as measures of lines on a map, right? And as dispassionate geopolitical arguments, or as assessments of the share of German. The share of the German gas market, who has what, right? I mean, so we have to keep that in mind, is that there's a lot of emotional, historical, intangible, soft stuff involved here that, as we all know in our own lives, that's what drives us. That's what motivates us, right? That's what gets the Russians to not really worry about manpower issues right now, because they seem to have plenty of young men signing up to go fight. It's not because those young men are reading scholarly articles, right? Or getting into deep historical conversations about what happened when Catherine the Great did this. It's the emotion, it's the romance of it, if you will, which is a terrible thing, because romance is so often tied into war, but it is, right? And so, yeah, we have to recall that. We have to keep that in mind, because otherwise we'll get wrapped up around in objective analysis that doesn't serve our purpose as well, because so much of this is subjective.
Yeah, and on Sweden and Finland, compared to Ukraine, I mean, for decades and decades, they've been pretty much de facto kind of NATO members. They take part in exercises all the time. They, arms, and, obviously, you can point to the fact that Ukraine did to actually take part in Iraq, in the Iraq war, but Finland and Sweden have kind of been de facto NATO members for a long time, where when Ukraine became a de facto NATO member from 2014 to now, Russia took very different action to Finland and Sweden. It never went that far. And and again, that could be a counter argument to this, that, Finland and Sweden were pretty much NATO anyway. So Russia, making NATO strong in that way, is a win for NATO, and it probably will make changes. But at the end of the day, they're like, they was NATO anyway, weren't they?
I think what you look at too, though, just in that, is just where the public opinion went, right, as well as the commitment to purchase arms. This is one of the things where I look at and I say Russia's invasion, it strengthens NATO. And there's disagreements within NATO and everything else, but NATO is not going to fall apart. Could you see a nation like Turkey leave NATO? Sure, of course. But that could happen for things completely unrelated to, Ukraine. But you see, like, say in Sweden and Finland, when I was there in Sweden and Finland in 2011, there was a solid, strong bloc arguing that we need to join NATO. But there are equally strong blocs arguing against it. And at that point, 11, 12 years ago, it was a long shot. And then now, I don't know what the vote in Sweden's parliament was, though. I'm pretty certain the vote in Finland's parliament was unanimous to join NATO. So this is the consequence of that invasion. And you also see all these European countries, we'll see if they go forward with it, but they're all committing to these massive arms purchases. Andrew Coburn, who has done such amazing work for years, going back decades, I remember as being in high school and being exposed to his work, he used to critique the the American Pentagon's assessment of the Soviet war machine. And it was just laughable. And he'll tell you, too, the Soviet assessment of the American military was also equally laughable, but they both, I mean, so I remember seeing it as a kid, though, or a high school kid, and just being amazed at that type of counter argument. And I think that had had a big impact on me. But, Andrew, some point earlier this year, maybe it was the end of last year, tallied up how much money was being spent by these European countries, these NATO countries, in terms of new F-35 purchases, new Leopard tank purchases. And you're talking about tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars. So, I mean, this has been just a bonanza for NATO and for the arms manufacturers. And what it does as well is it gives NATO a purpose. It gives it a holy purpose. So say what I think will happen, you get a frozen conflict or whatever, but Russia's not leaving the Donbass, Ukraine can't kick them out. And the Donbass now becomes NATO's Jerusalem, right? Where this is the holy, it's not just the threat or the fear or the hysteria over the Russian hordes coming into Europe. It's this idea that we have to take back what they have taken from us. What these barbarians took, we have to go. And I think, so you have Donetsk is, NATO's Jerusalem. Like that type of thing. Luhansk is like that, Crimea certainly is, right? And the way they speak about it, they do speak about it in almost like these religious type terms. So this invasion then provides that reason for being for NATO that had detractors. You did have detractors. I mean, chief among them, Donald Trump, but there were also serious, sincere people who were saying that NATO's time is done. It's outlived its usefulness. What is its purpose? I think was it Macron who said that NATO was brain dead or something like that? It was someone like that said something a number of years ago, several years ago, because there was that feeling. But now the NATO is not on life support. It's not on a ventilator. It's up and running marathons at this point.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to your point there, I mean, Ukraine for the arms industry is just, I mean, like you said, like earlier in the show that, there was the meeting and that Ukraine become this and BA systems in the UK, like they're expanding, their share price just keeps going up and up and up. And that they're going to open their own thing, their own shop in Ukraine, which, I mean, I have kind of questions about that Russia would probably bomb those. I'm not sure how that's going to work. BA systems, not just supplying Ukraine, now operating inside Ukraine. I'm interested to see if that actually happens, because I mean, that seems like a potential legitimate target, but that's another question. But yeah, it's just such an arms boom, and it's. I mean, again, I'm young. I don't know how it was with other wars. It's obviously quite obvious, but this one, like, he's explicitly appealing. Like the arms dealers, you can be the ones to kind of keep this going. And I mean, just to kind of move on to the next kind of, I know we don't have loads of time left, but I mean, people should check out your article about that, make up your own mind. Again, people should know that obviously you see the US side of this and you brought that up, but it's good to see a counter argument to that, because we haven't really seen much of that. And some people might say people have been too easy on Russia because they focus too much on their own government, or they think that was the right move because Russia had no choice. But yeah, so I'll put it up on the screen, I'll put it in the show notes. People should check out your article. But just for like Ukrainian support, where do you see that going? Because Israel's just taken over the headlines, and we was chatting before we got started where even myself, like I follow this. Ukraine was just out of my mind, and I was there for a second thinking, like, there's still people fighting right now, still people dying, still people in tanks. But in my head, it's like, they're having the World War I break for Christmas, and they're celebrating together, and they're having their cups of teas and stuff. But that's ongoing. So obviously there's this bill at the moment where they're trying to cram China, Israel, Ukraine all into this big bill to get it passed, because no one's going to say no to Israel. So if you sneak in Ukraine in there, then you'll probably get the passes. So where do you see support for Ukraine going? It's been a big push, Republicans for Ukraine, like Bill Kristol, you have Lindsey Graham and all these other people. And again, there are arguments like you have to support Ukraine for a stand against China, because there's Republicans who, they're more like, why are we supporting Ukraine? Not on a morality, point, because they're like, we need to supporting Taiwan because China's the real enemy, or like Iran, take your pick. But so where do you think the support for Ukraine is going to go in Europe? There was, a recent article, I'm not sure where it was, that Zelensky is going on another lobbying tour, and also Europeans, as there's been statements from the EU, like, we need to keep the support for Ukraine going. We can't let Israel get in the way of our proxy war of Russia. So a bit of a long-winded question, but, where do you see the support going for Ukraine?
Yeah, and I think you've had Kyle Anzalone on, haven't you? Yeah, and I think Kyle just reported, and folks watching follow Kyle Anzalone. He runs a podcast called Conflicts of Interest and writes for he's one of the editors for antiwar.com. If you're interested in this stuff, you should be subscribing to antiwar.com and get their digests every day. Very helpful. But I think it was Kyle who was saying the Europeans are going to be sending a lobby delegation to the U.S. To try and keep up support. So within the American Congress, there are the votes for Ukraine aid. So it's not like a question as if the Ukraine aid is going to be, if there's a straight vote on it, it's going to lose. The problem is that procedurally, there are those in power now, particularly with Mike Johnson becoming the new Speaker of the House, so the top person in the lower part of the American Congress, the House of Representatives, who has a mixed record on Ukraine. Bill Kristol's group gave him an F, but that's I don't think they're the most objective grading, not the most objective grading process. But certainly the idea that aid for Ukraine is going to roll through the American Congress like it did 20 months ago is just not. It's just not there. There's a number of reasons for it. But like I said, the votes are there to get the 60 votes needed in the Senate and to get the 220 votes needed in the House or so. That's there. There's enough members, particularly because the Democrats will vote almost in unison for these packages. The thing that it was is that to ensure that there was no delay and that there were no procedural problems and it wouldn't get thwarted because both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, members can do things. I'm sure it's the same thing in the UK's Parliament and everywhere else. You can do things to gum up the works. You can do things to slow things down. You can do things to block things if you're that serious about it. And so that was the fear, is that it would get blocked, it would get delayed, you'd have to vote for, it either get poison pilled, which means that something is attached to it that's also voted on that is just anathema. And that's what, there'll be something that will have to, something will be attached to it that is distasteful, that has to be gone along with. So what we're seeing right now happen with aid for Israel, which would go through the American Congress near unanimously. I mean, everyone in the Senate's going to vote for it, and all of maybe 12 or 15 House members would vote for it. What the new Speaker of the House did, what Speaker Johnson did, was he attached to that there's this idea that anything, it's called pay-go, anything that is spent has to be offset. So if you increase spending by $1 billion, you have to decrease spending somewhere else. So the offset that is the Israelis going to be paid for is through the Internal Revenue Service, through the IRS. So the $14.5 billion for Israel would be offset by $14.5 billion in cuts for the IRS, which is a big problem for the Democrats, right? And then you look at this and you say, this is just incredible. Yeah, how could you get something that sustains ethnic cleansing and makes the rich in America even richer? And they're able to do it. They're able to combine those two things, ethnic cleansing and effectively tax cuts, because you'd be harming the IRS so much, there'd be very little ability to ensure people were paying their taxes accurately or fairly or honestly. So I mean, you have the politics of it all, but you also have a lessening of spirit for the Ukraine war. You're seeing much harsher reporting. Again, I brought up that Time magazine article by Simon Schuster, which everybody should read. It is breathtaking in its candor. I've not seen anything written by a major Western establishment media outlet like this. We will see criticism of Ukraine. We have seen criticism of Ukraine in the Post, in the Times, and wherever. But it's usually limited to one subject. So they talk about corruption. They talk about they don't have enough ammunition, et cetera. And then, but there's always a burnishing, a polishing of hope that is put around it, as well as just the overall narrative continues along the good versus evil, right? A Manichaean narrative. And this Time magazine piece does not do any of that. It puts it all together. It doesn't give the idea that progress is right around the corner, or it doesn't have that quote from a retired general or some think tank expert about all you need is a little more money, a little more time, and successful company, like that type of. None of that nonsense is there, and it certainly isn't draped with a cloak of good versus evil. So that Time magazine piece is really worth reading and sharing with people as well. But you also see possibly this opportunity because of what's happening with Palestine, Israel, to disassociate ourselves from Ukraine, right? That this is an opportunity. This thing has failed. We never should have committed like this. I don't want to own up to that commitment, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. And here's a great thing. And my friend brought this up. He said how, the Ukraine, he walks around through his neighborhood and the Ukrainian flags that were hanging outside people's homes are no longer there. And we were saying, well, Halloween's coming out so people can put up their Halloween decorations, and we have our Thanksgiving so people put up their Thanksgiving decorations, and of course Christmas, and it gives you an excuse to take down that Ukrainian flag because you don't want to own up to that commitment any longer. It's a failed commitment. It's a lost cause. It was never a good cause. It was always an unwinnable war, right, that you jumped on board and cheerled for, and now Ukraine has just suffered so viciously. One of the things this Time magazine piece brought up, and it's been cited other places too, is that the average age of a soldier in Ukraine is 43 years old. They have run through all their young men. All their young men are dead. This generation is destroyed. And so I think people see the folly of what they had committed to, a folly of what they were pushing. And Israel-Palestine gives them the opportunity to no longer talk about that, to take down the blue and yellow flag and put up, Thanksgiving's coming here in the U.S., so you put up a flag with a turkey on it or a flag with a pumpkin on it or something like that, And of course, never too early to put up Christmas decorations. And I know you guys in the UK are as bad as we are here in the U.S. about that stuff. So, but yeah.
So just on what you said there about, just what you said about the age of the average Ukrainian. So, obviously it said that, the US and the NATO allies can keep this going if they can keep chucking money in, the arms lobby can keep going and going and going. But is there a point where you can't chuck any more money at it because the Ukrainians army, like you said, these young people are dead, wounded, cannot fight? Is there a point where Ukraine's it physically can't because they've ran out of men, actual men?
Right. Yeah, you have that. And the Time magazine piece actually talks about that, where it's like, who's going to send us these weapons? Who's going to use them? And there is in this piece as well, revelations that Ukrainian units refused orders to continue the offensive, to advance, on Russian positions because they didn't have the ammunition, they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the manpower. They also knew that it was folly, that it was going to fail. We saw this more than a month and a half ago or so, where you had the general, his name escapes me now, who was in charge of the southern front for Ukraine, saying to CNN, and I think Zelensky as well, the top general, had said similar things, or maybe it was Budanov, the head of military intelligence, or someone like that. But you'd seen this from a number of senior people, that we don't launch. We don't operate at anything larger than 12 or 15 men. Our attacks are all what we call squad level size attacks, right? So, I mean, it just showed just how utterly failed the Ukrainian military was, that they were not able to launch attacks larger than 12 or 15 men. I mean, I don't know what at that point, you're not involved in an offensive. This is just this is a stalemated front that, you know, you can make no progress with. And then for all different reasons, the effectiveness of Russian firepower, the effectiveness of the Russians' drones, their surveillance, your inability to command and control, your inability to fully staff up your units or man up your units, your ability to provide them with ammunition, your ability to launch competent, coordinated attacks, on and on, leads you to this point where you can only have these small unit operations, which again, that's not an offensive. So, you know, you see all that and you realize that the circumstances of the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian military. And I think this is, you go back 6 months, many of us were saying, do not launch this offensive. Do not do this thing. And I think the offensive went worse than most of us expected. Certainly it lasted longer than most of us expected. But in terms of how poorly the Ukrainian military performed, in terms of just negligible, at best negligible results from the offensive, gains of mere kilometers. That was it, like completely insignificant. But worse, the loss of men, material, munitions that can't be gotten back. The Ukrainians shot everything they had. They used up so much that they are in such a perilous position now. And the thing that does hold the Russians back, I believe, is one, they don't want to occupy, as we've spoken before. They don't want to overextend, as we've spoken about before. They have their own issues, I think, with their logistics and their tail end. So they don't want to overextend. They've gotten very good limited territorial gains. So if one of the arguments for the invasion was we're going in to protect the people of eastern Ukraine, the Russian-speaking people, the Donbass, et cetera, as well as we want to have a corridor, a line of communication between Crimea and Russia proper, they have all that now. So there's the argument that Russia has done well, they have achieved their objectives, they have met their goals. You can make that argument. They push forward, and now they're overextending themselves, and they enter into risks and everything else. But the thing about it, though, is the drones, you know. And so this idea of Ukraine running out of men. One, a lot of that's on them for launching this horrible offensive, and as well as two, their defense of Bakhmut. They lost tens of thousands of men, both killed and wounded, defending Bakhmut, a city that even near agreement, Western military leaders and analysts were saying, even the people I agree with on everything else, most of them were saying, come March, April of last year, give up Bakhmut. It doesn't hold any value. It's just simply symbolic. There's no military value to it, and you're losing. You're playing right in their hands. The Russians are just walking their Wagner prisoner forces up there and letting you waste entire units against them. They're just treating you in a way that you can't sustain. And then you launch this offensive where you just throw everything you have into these well-prepared Russian defensive lines. You achieve nothing other than the slaughter of your own men and the waste of material and munitions. And now here you are. So what do they have, though, is the drones. And the evolution of the drones. We are in a different position than we were 20 months ago. Where the drones have evolved, their use, the know-how how to use them, everything else, the fact that they are, and I think we'll start seeing the autonomous, if they're not already being used. And we know that autonomous drones have been used. The Turkish autonomous drone was used in Libya back in 2015 or 2016 or something like that. So we know that they have been used already. So this idea, though, that the drones are what can hold back the Russians, because you can't assemble your forces. You can't get your tanks in a column. You can't mass your troops without the drones seeing it and then the drones attacking it. And so that can be the bulwark, that can be the defense that holds back the Russians. But I'm speculating. It may not be that way. Like, I'm just going off of what I've seen so far, what I can kind of think or assess may occur. And yeah, the drones have changed warfare in a way that you have to go back to, the airplane, or to go back to the breech loading rifle, and the machine gun in the late 19th century. Like, they've had that type of effect in terms of the implications for militaries in terms of how they operate. And, is that what will hold the Russians back? But the dire straits the Ukrainians are in, because yes, the American Congress eventually will send the Ukrainians more money. The Europeans will, the Brits will. I don't think we'll see that fail. It will take longer. It will involve a lot of political concessions, in the U.S., in Britain, to get that aid there. Where you might see some real problems is whether or not these governments are going to continue to prop up the Ukrainian economy and to prop up the Ukrainian government. So whereas you may have tens of billions of dollars go forward to send the Ukrainians more artillery shells, buy them more drones, will you have the money? Because right now the West is paying for the Ukrainian government. Ukrainian civil servants, pensioners, they're all receiving their money because of foreign assistance. And the U.S. provides a huge part of that, most of that. If that stops, does the Ukrainian government collapse? Does the Ukrainian economy collapse? And here's another aspect of it as well. You have such a corrupt system over there. And best example is the most recent example in Afghanistan, where as soon as it's such a corrupt hierarchy, and it's all conditioned on the money coming in. The money is what keeps it afloat. The money what keeps it inflated. That as soon as the money dries up, or not even as soon as the money dries up, as soon as the threat or the fear of the money dries up, you start having collapse. So what happens is, if you got this corrupt pyramid and the money comes in at the top, and as soon as those at the top start to fear that no more money is going to be coming in, they stop sending money down. And then that money not going down, that panic that then ensues causes the collapse. Right. And we saw this in Afghanistan 6 months before the Taliban take Kabul. The Afghan army, the Afghan police, they're not getting paid. They're not getting fed. They're not getting resupplied of ammunition. And the U.S. at that point was still providing $300 million. We're still spending $300 million a day. Joe Biden at that point hadn't made a decision to leave Afghanistan, but the fear was there. And then that started a panic and then collapse. And that you could see happen, right? And if that happens, then there's no way the front line's going to hold. It's going to fall back in on itself. And then the Russians, of course, have to make a decision. Do they want to just hold what they have, maybe advance, maybe go up to the river, or do they want to push all the way through? And then the dangers we were talking about before. Then they're occupying, they're in control of a collapsed country. What do they get out of that? But then the fears that maybe the Poles and the Romanians would push forward to form a buffer, right? All this stuff. And so it's very dangerous, even though we're not talking about it. It's very dangerous. And the fact that the reports are that the Russian Avika, I believe it's how it's pronounced. That's southwest of Kupiansk, so more or less central part of the Ukrainian front. Russians are throwing a lot of troops into that battle right now. Massive Russian artillery bombardments going on. So this war is just as deadly as it was prior to October 7th. It's just that it's been removed from discussion.
Yeah, just for kind of the final question, I'm glad you mentioned that. So obviously we didn't get into maybe the counter side of, what Russia has achieved. You obviously mentioned a few things there and objectives they might have met. But just as a final kind of question, I feel like we've gone over Ukraine and there's so much more to talk about there. But just as a final question, just to kind of interlink Ukraine and Israel, obviously Russia's relationship with Israel throughout this conflict has been kind of interesting to watch, where Israel hasn't wanted to directly supply, as they walk in a very fine line with Russia. I don't know loads about it, but I know people say they have a kind of a bit of a neutral relationship. There's a lot of Russians in Israel, and obviously Israel bombs Syria, and Russia kind of gives them a pass,
right?
Almost there. So where do you see relations going with Russia and Israel in this conflict? You know, there's been reports of Russian officials being much stronger coming out against Israel, and with BRICS and the global South, it only seems more logical that what does Russia really have that much with the relationship with Israel? The US's biggest ally, an ally of the West, all the rest. What does Russia really have? What's holding together their relationship with Israel that has this whole time in this kind of new world BRICS order? So where do you see Russia and Israel's relationship? And if there was a regional war with Hezbollah and Iran, probably Russia might not get involved because they've got a lot on their plate. But where do you see Israel's and Russia's relationship going?
Yeah, I think we can look at it as what value does Russia see in what does Russia see as getting out of this? And by taking a harder approach to Israel, is that going to continue to develop their relationship with Turkey, right? Is that certainly that relationship between Putin and Erdogan very important? Turkey has been a lifeline in many ways to Russia, particularly economically, this last year and a half. I mean, their trade has drastically increased, and it's a Black Sea neighbor, and it's also a NATO nation, everything else. There's the value Russia sees in expanding its relationship with Turkey, with Iran, of course, its ally in Syria, but then also, too, how can it advance its interests in Jordan and in Egypt by taking a harder line to Israel, by listening to these people. Certainly the Israelis are not happy with the Russians for hosting that Hamas delegation a week or so ago. My attitude to that is somebody's got to be talking to these folks. And the Russians have people that they want released. I mean, but someone's got to be talking to them. So by agreeing with these Arab nations, the Turks, the Gulf monarchies, then of course the Iranians, does that give them a better position long term in the Middle East, as well as more allies and more people, who are part of this growing counter to American hegemony, right? And certainly then does it build allies? And one of the things I think as we look at, well, how do we get this thing to stop in Gaza? And because the Americans are not going to tell the Israelis to stop it because it's ethnic cleansing. They're not, they're fully supporting it. They're not going to tell them to stop it because of the danger of escalation into a regional war, because they haven't done that and they're not going to. They're just going to send more troops there and more equipment and more planes and ships to make sure the U.S. is better positioned if something like that happens, but they're not going to hold back the Israelis. So what does it come to? It comes down to U.S. Political aspects. And, this war in Gaza has had an effect on the president's poll numbers, particularly within the Democratic Party. 80% of Democrats want a ceasefire, and Biden is just dead set against it. The whole entire Democratic Party nearly is. And, there's this dissonance between what the American public wants, how it feels, and what the U.S. political establishment and most of its media is saying is massive. So is that one way that the White House realized this could cost us in 2024, that, just a couple million progressive voters decide not to vote for Joe Biden? Doesn't mean they're going to vote for Donald Trump, but next, a year from now, they're going to say, you know what? Enabling, sustaining, supporting the ethnic cleansing, the genocide of Gaza is too much. I'm not voting for him. No matter what you're telling me, I can't vote for those war crimes, right? And is that enough to throw the election to Trump? The other thing then, too, I think, is what if the Russians and the Saudis and the other members, the other OPEC members, say the U.S., if you don't get the Israelis to stop this, 12 months from now, you're going to have $7 gallon gas, right? So a repeat of 73, right? That's not anything too fantastic. Doesn't take too much of an imagination. Just need a brief knowledge of modern history to see how that could happen. And so, possibly that. And then the Russians then have this role they can play of leading such a thing. But then you also see where the Chinese come into this as well, where the Chinese, particularly with the rapprochement, I guess it was over the summertime that they kind of enabled and brought forth, but with Saudi Arabia and Iran, these nations tend to now be seen as better guarantors of security and stability in the Middle East than the Americans do, right? So, I mean, all of those things, but then also too, you have to come back to the American politics and, this attempt, and you've seen this and you've already seen the linkages. We have to give Ukraine money for Ukraine because of China, saying the same thing too about Israel. Money has to go to Israel because of China. I mean, they're making these, the contortions that they go through to make these arguments are amazing. But one of the things you have to remember is that in the U.S. political environment, Putin is connected to Trump, right? So standing up to Putin is standing up to Trump. I mean, you have this right? And so the argument to make is to make Hamas to Putin to Trump. And so that type of pressure then, if the White House decides that's how they want to make this argument, and certainly we saw that about 2 months ago when the White House released, I think it was its first campaign ad, and the ad was of Joe Biden visiting Kiev and portraying him as a wartime commander-in-chief. And a few weeks ago, right after October 7th, when Joe Biden rushed to Israel, the arguments were that we've never had a commander-in-chief who has visited 2 war zones without the protection of the U.S. military, right? But that was the line. That was the politics of it. So again, they can make that connection. Standing up for democracy, standing against Hamas, standing against Putin, equate that to Trump. I think that's where they may want to go with this. But the danger then, of course, is that they're going to lose progressive voters, and that might throw the election to Trump. So yeah, I think that's ultimately how I kind of see this happening, and it's awful that's also how I see how this cessation of the ethnic cleansing actually occurs, either because of domestic political concerns here in the U.S. or because of some type of pressure like a oil embargo or an oil shock by nations like Russia, Saudi Arabia, whoever.
Yeah, no, I think that's all good points. We don't have loads of time. Just quickly, actually, really quickly on the Arab nations and the Gulf monarchies. Do you think the Gulf monarchies actually care about it, or is it just they have to, for PR reasons and for their own population, seen as that? Because obviously we've seen Saudi Arabia attempt potential normalization with Israel before this. You had other countries who normalized relations. So do you think it's more they have to as a PR move, or is this for real? They actually are like, this is too far, or is it just too far for them to sit back and not say anything because it shows they actually don't really care about Palestinians? Because other than the religious aspect, they have no problem seeing Iraqis die or Yemenis die. So they don't care, about the other Arabs who they want to have power over. So just quickly, briefly, do you think it's just more about PR and public face?
I think it's I think they are serious about it. A lot of it has to do with internal public pressure, right? So the pressure coming up from the bottom towards them. But I think they also want to be seen as serious. So you look at a nation like Qatar that wants to be seen as a serious player, as a leader, right? And they want to have they want to do well here with it, so that in the future they are in spaces where they have an impact, they have influence because of how they led on this issue. So I think it's a mix of both. Certainly you look at MBS or the dictator Sisi, they're not very concerned about the Palestinian people. They're not going to do the right thing because it's morally correct. But there are internal political pressures. There are advantages they see that they can be gained from this. And then I think also, too, they are, to a degree, repulsed by what they are seeing. They are seeing the ethnic cleansing, and it is against Muslims. right? I mean, so there is, I think it is a mix of it, but it is serious. It is sincere. They certainly were willing to do normalization, and if they could get away with it, they would have. This is part of what Hamas is doing here, but saying we will not be ignored, because the normalization process completely excluded the Palestinians. And I think most of these Arab leaders, if the Palestinians could just quietly go away and never be heard from again, they'd be happy with that. But that's not going to happen, and that's then going to have a massive impact on their populations. That pressure is going to come up from below, but then also too, they possibly see an advantage, as well as, the reality of how wrong this is. And this is an opportunity, maybe, as we were talking about Russia and China, for them to see other opportunities to get out of the American orbit, right?
Yeah, I think that's all good points, but you've given me over an hour and a half of your time. I was meant to finish up about the hour mark, but it's too hard to resist to carry on. So thank you for coming on. I apologize for people who have a cold. So if you saw me, I was coughing. Yeah, thank you for coming on, Matt. I really appreciate your time, as always. You literally came on about 2 weeks ago to talk about Israel. So people should check that out. Check out your work. Follow you on Twitter. I'll put it all in the show notes and up on the screen. But yeah, thank you for again coming on. I hope people enjoyed seeing the other side of the argument, maybe for Russia. But yeah, thank you again for coming on, Matt. I always appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks.